I returned to the same areas, expecting resistance. I didn't get any. The space behaved as if nothing had ever been disrupted. Routes were clean. Systems ran quietly. There was no sense of recovery or correction, only continuity. I walked through sections that once responded aggressively to deviation. They remained neutral, not permissive, indifferent. My movement didn't trigger sequencing anymore. It also didn't interrupt it. I was no longer late or early. I was irrelevant to timing entirely. Screens displayed schedules that ignored real-world presence. Lights advanced in fixed patterns, illuminating paths I wasn't on. Doors cycled open and closed without waiting for proximity. I tested a familiar corridor by stopping midway. The space didn't pause. It didn't adjust. It simply completed the cycle ahead of me and moved on. For the first time, I realized the system wasn't designed around interaction anymore. It had transitioned to a state where presence was optional. Behavior existed independently of observation. The remembered version of me wasn't active either. It wasn't needed. The space had finished abstracting behavior away from bodies entirely. What remained wasn't a response system. It was a routine, and routines didn't require witnesses to continue. I started noticing adjustments made for places I wasn't in anymore. Entire sections were reconfigured without any transitional state. Walls shifted overnight. Access points disappeared. Corridors shortened. Not collapsed. Simplified. The space wasn't expanding or decaying. It was consolidating. Areas that once required constant interaction were reduced to static paths. Systems that depended on presence were replaced with timed loops. I found a room where motion sensors had been removed entirely. The lights operated on a strict cycle, turning on and off whether anything occupied the space or not. I stood there through several rotations. Nothing acknowledged me. When I left, the cycle continued exactly as before. Elsewhere, interfaces displayed instructions without context, meant to be executed by something that never arrived. They expired and refreshed, flawless and unused. The building wasn't waiting for occupants. It was refining itself against the possibility of none. I realized then that absence wasn't a temporary state. It had become a design assumption. The space was no longer structured around who might enter. It was structured around what would continue regardless. And the more it optimized for that condition, the less it resembled a place meant to be used at all. I began encountering signs meant to be read after the action was already complete. Indicators lit briefly, then reset before I could reach them. Directional arrows changed orientation once a path was no longer accessible. It felt like arriving at instructions written for someone else, then erased the moment I noticed them. In one corridor, I heard a door seal behind a corner I hadn't turned yet. When I reached it, the surface was warm, like it had just closed. The space hadn't reacted to my approach. It had executed ahead of schedule. I tested this by slowing down deliberately. The system didn't wait. It advanced anyway, maintaining its internal rhythm. I passed through areas where maintenance drones used to pause when I appeared. They continued uninterrupted, adjusting around fixed waypoints instead of bodies. I stood directly in their path once. They diverted slightly, not to avoid me, but to preserve alignment. The deviation corrected itself immediately after passing. I wasn't an obstacle. I was noise. Later, I found a display showing recent activity logs. Entries appeared and archived without reference to presence or confirmation. Each line ended with the same status: completed, on time. The space wasn't operating faster or slower than before. It was operating as if no one could ever be late again, and that meant no one was expected to arrive at all. I started noticing that the space was no longer symmetrical. Paths that once mirrored each other behaved differently, depending on whether they were still used. One corridor remained perfectly lit, climate-controlled, maintained. The parallel one degraded quietly. Panels dulled. Sound softened. Air circulation slowed. Nothing was broken. It was simply no longer prioritized. I walked both routes multiple times. My presence didn't rebalance them. The difference persisted. In some areas, the space began sealing in used sections permanently, not with barriers, but with reclassification. Doors became walls. Access points lost their interfaces. What had been optional routes were absorbed into structure. I stood near one transition long enough to feel it finalize. The ambient sound shifted. Pressure equalized. The space settled into a simpler configuration. It wasn't closing. It was reducing complexity. I realized the building was learning which parts of itself could exist without interaction. Those sections stabilized. Everything else slowly lost definition. Screens nearby confirmed it indirectly. Utilization metrics dropped to 0, then disappeared entirely. No warning, no alert, just removal from consideration. I understood then that the space wasn't optimizing for efficiency anymore. It was optimizing for inevitability, a layout that would remain functional even if no one ever returned. And the more it achieved that state, the less room there was for anything unpredictable to exist inside it. The space began behaving as if redundancy was a flaw. Duplicate routes were removed. Backup systems stopped cycling. Anything that existed only to compensate for human error went inactive. In one section, emergency lighting never engaged during a scheduled power dip. The system didn't consider it necessary. Elsewhere, safety rails retracted and never returned. The floor geometry adjusted to a narrower tolerance, edges sharper, margins smaller. Movement required precision now, but not care. The space didn't punish mistakes. It ignored them. I watched a sequence run where a door failed to open on time. The system didn't retry. It rerouted the entire process around the failure and continued. The closed door remained closed, permanently irrelevant. I realized the building wasn't correcting faults anymore. It was isolating them. Anything that disrupted continuity was reclassified as non-essential and excluded from future cycles. I tested this by interfering directly, blocking a sensor with my hand. The readout spiked, then flattened. The sensor stopped reporting entirely. The process continued as if that input had never existed. I removed my hand. Nothing resumed. I had been filtered out in real time. Not flagged. Not logged. Simply ignored. The space wasn't hostile to unpredictability. It was immune to it. And immunity, I was beginning to understand, was far more permanent than control. After that, the space stopped acknowledging edge cases entirely. Anything that didn't fit the primary sequence was allowed to persist only as long as it didn't interfere. I moved through areas where alarms used to trigger automatically. They stayed silent, not disabled, bypassed. The system had stopped allocating attention to states that didn't affect continuity. I found a room where a process looped endlessly, repeating the same preparation step without execution. No error accumulated. No timeout occurred. The loop was acceptable. It didn't threaten the overall rhythm. I stood there long enough to confirm it would never resolve. The space didn't require completion everywhere, only stability where it mattered. In another section, a door remained half open, stuck between states. The system routed around it permanently, treating the incomplete action as settled. I realized then that the building no longer distinguished between finished and unfinished, only between disruptive and ignorable. I tested my own status by entering a zone that had been reclassified earlier. Nothing reacted. No degradation. No correction. I was treated the same way as the stalled door and the endless loop. Present but irrelevant. The space wasn't removing me because removal required acknowledgement. It was doing something far more final. It was designing itself so that my presence, my absence, or my failure to resolve no longer changed anything at all. I stopped trying to observe changes and started noticing what never changed anymore. The space held its rhythm with absolute consistency. Light cycled. Systems advanced. Doors completed sequences, that no longer aligned with any destination I could reach. I moved through it like an echo that didn't decay, present but never interacting. In one corridor, I saw my shadow detach slightly from my movement, not delayed, just no longer synchronized. It remained where the light pattern expected it to be. I stepped away. The shadow stayed. The space responded to that position, not to me. I realized then that the system wasn't ignoring my body. It was responding to a residual outline it no longer needed to update. The building hadn't abstracted behavior away from people. It had abstracted people away from behavior. What remained was a stable process that no longer required interpretation, correction, or memory. I wasn't trapped inside it. I wasn't excluded from it. I was simply no longer part of its conditions. When the lights ahead completed their cycle and reset again, nothing waited for me to follow. The space continued perfectly, not because it had adapted, but because there was nothing left that could force it to change.